Hello, welcome to Chapter 1. In this chapter, we will be focusing primarily on three sections, sections 1.1, 1.5, and 1.6. And these are the sections of the chapter you should focus on when you are reading the textbook. As the name of the chapter suggests, in this lecture, we will be discussing the major themes of anatomy and physiology, themes which we will be exploring in a lot more detail throughout not only Biology 131, but also in Biology 132. For right now, however, it is essential to gain a general understanding of these important ideas so that we can explore them together in more detail in the future. Since this is a biology course, Biology 131, Human Biology 1, let's start with that. Do you know what biology is? Can you provide a definition? Simply put, biology is the study of life. But what is the definition of life? Even as children, we know that a tree is alive and a rock isn't. But why? Why are we considered alive, but the chair we are sitting on is not? Can you provide a definition of life? Take a few seconds and give it a try. You're probably realizing that it's trickier than you might first think, isn't it? Life is too complex to be able to provide a simple, one-sentence definition. Rather, life is recognized by what living things do. Your textbook names 8 properties that are used to distinguish living things from non-living things. One of the most important properties is that all living things are composed of cells, which we will be coming back to discuss in more detail. The other 7 properties can be seen depicted here. Maybe you touched on some of these in your definition of life. Let's go through them together. Reproduction. When I ask this question in a class, this is usually one of the first properties students correctly identify as a necessary feature of life. The ability to pass genetic information from one generation to the next, either by a single cell duplicating itself or by having genes from 2 parents mix to produce an entirely new individual. Reproduction is essential for all biological organisms. Development involves 2 major processes, growth and differentiation. Keep in mind that we all originated as one single fertilized egg. How did we become the complex multicellular organism that we are? That one cell reproduced itself many times, and we grew in cell number and in size. These cells also underwent differentiation. They began to specialize in a particular task. They became muscle cells, skin cells, nerve cells, and blood cells. We continue to grow and develop throughout our lives, through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and old age, different at each stage of our life. Metabolism, another incredibly important feature of life, and one we will definitely be coming back to repeatedly. I'm sure you have heard the term metabolism, but considering how it is used in everyday life, you may not know the proper definition. Metabolism refers to all of the chemical reactions that take place in the body. The buildup of smaller, simpler molecules into larger, complex ones, as well as the breakdown of these larger, complex molecules into simpler, smaller ones. These chemical reactions allow us to take in molecules from our environment, from the food that we eat, and the water that we drink, and the air that we breathe, and chemically change them to provide us with energy or use them to build the structures of our cells. Any of the wastes that are produced by these chemical reactions must be eliminated from the body. For example, carbon dioxide must be breathed out. It is easy to underestimate the number of these chemical reactions taking place in the body, but there is a constant turnover of molecules. Nearly all of your body has been replaced within the past year. Homeostasis. Keep in mind that living things need order and stability. So although we may encounter changes in our environment, we must have the ability to always maintain stable internal conditions, such as this rabbit using its long ears to help maintain its body temperature. As we will be discussing later in this chapter, the ability to maintain homeostasis is vital to our survival. Organization. The universe naturally moves towards disorder. Is it easier to throw a deck of the cards in the air and have them scatter and make a mess and become random and disorganized? Or is it easier to arrange them so each of the suits are separated and in numerical order, like when you first open them? It takes energy to keep things organized. Just picture trying to keep your home or apartment organized. It takes effort. Living things, unlike non-living things in the universe, have order and structure. Our cells, our bodies expend huge amounts of energy trying to maintain order. A breakdown in this order usually leads to illness or even death. Evolution. This seahorse can blend into its environment, increasing its chances for survival. Although no single individual evolves over the course of its own lifespan, evolution is incredibly important for the survival of a species. We have all heard of Darwin's theory of evolution, of his theory of the survival of the fittest. Mutations, changes in the DNA structure, allow variations among individuals of a species, which can be passed on to their offspring, and may give that species an increased likelihood of being able to survive. Lastly, responsiveness and movement. All living things respond to their environment, whether it is by nerves and muscles like we do, allowing us to move away from something harmful, or to move food through our digestive system, to move air in and out of our lungs, or pump blood throughout our body. But even a plant, which we don't think of as having movement per se, will grow towards the sun, and its roots will reach out in the direction of water. Without this ability, we would never survive. Hopefully, throughout this semester, and in Biology 132, you will gain a greater understanding and appreciation for the importance of these 8 properties and their role in living organisms, particularly humans. Although the title of this course is Human Biology, we will specifically be studying anatomy and physiology. In fact, you may have noticed that that is the name of your textbook. So, making sure that we all have an understanding of what these terms mean is just as important as understanding the definition of biology. Can you define anatomy and physiology? Go ahead and give it a try. Anatomy is the study of structure, or form. Physiology is the study of function. The name of your textbook is called Anatomy and Physiology, the unity of form and function. It is extremely important to understand that although anatomy and physiology are 2 different fields of study, they are very much interrelated. What something is capable of doing, its function, is very dependent on its structure, its form. A simple non-biological example are tools we design to perform a certain task. The structure of a screwdriver is very different from the structure of a hammer, because they have been specifically shaped to best perform the task they are being used for. Now, on occasion, I have been known to use a high-heel shoe as a hammer, but let's face it, it's not as efficient as a hammer. You will never see a construction worker using a high-heel shoe to build a house. Similarly, structures in the body have certain features because these structures will best be able to carry out the necessary functions. Throughout this semester, you should constantly be asking yourself, what is unique and important about this structure? How does its structure relate to its function? What does its structure tell you about its function? As the semester goes on, you will probably tire of hearing me say, structure is function and function is structure. But take it for what it is, a reminder to always be asking yourself these questions and making these associations. Don't memorize, but rather understand why things in the body have the structure they have and how they work the way that they do. Make it make sense. As we study human biology throughout Biology 131 and 132, it is important to recognize that there are different levels at which we can study anatomy and physiology, different levels at which we can study the structure and function of the body. This semester, we will be starting at the very basic level and working our way up, starting at the atomic level and working our way up all the way to the whole organism. I often find that when students enroll in an anatomy and physiology class, that they are expecting the entire semester to involve the naming of bones and muscles, and they are sometimes disappointed to learn that we will be spending a great deal of time studying what basically amounts to chemistry, as well as looking at cells and tissues. We start at the basic levels because it is easier to understand complex systems by studying its simpler components, a theory known as reductionism. And as you have already seen by how difficult it was to even define life, A living organism is an extremely complex system. So it is by studying the structure and function of the body at these basic levels that we understand the way the body truly works. However, while it may be easier to understand the whole by looking at the individual parts, bear in mind that whenever we reduce things down to its basic components, you lose something. Every time we move up to a higher level of organization, look at a larger part, we will see that there are emergent properties, unique features, properties, capabilities that arise and emerge when the individual parts come together and work together. Therefore, while we will definitely be using reductionism to study the human body, don't forget about holism. Don't forget to take a step back and look how the individual parts work together to become more than they are individually, because we human beings are definitely more than the sum of our parts. We will be spending a lot of time looking at all of these levels of organization in a lot of detail over the next 2 semesters. But right now, I just wanted to very briefly discuss some of the unique features of each level and hopefully underscore the importance of studying biology at all of these levels of organization. First, we have the atomic level. Atoms are the smallest particles with unique chemical identities, and they are the building blocks of all things, both living and non-living. I'm sure you've seen a periodic table at some point in your education, even if you don't remember much about it. It is essentially a chart of all of the elements that make up matter, each with its own type of atoms. Throughout Chapter 2, we will be exploring the atomic level and looking at this periodic table and the major elements needed for life in much more detail. But for right now, it is important to recognize that even at this level, we see the relationship between structure and function. The number and position of protons, neutrons, and especially electrons that make up an atom ultimately lead to the unique properties of each element. Physical properties are those that we can detect with our senses, such as color, texture, boiling point, and freezing point. Chemical properties refer to the way atoms interact with other atoms, bonding behavior, which we will also study in Chapter 2. Bonding behavior of atoms is going to be especially important because the bonding of atoms is going to result in the next level of organization. The molecular level. Molecules are 2 or more atoms held together by chemical bonds. Once again, you can see evidence of how important structure is for function. For example, molecules of morphine are capable of reducing pain because they are capable of binding to receptors, which are also molecules, in our body. They can bind to these receptors because they fit, like puzzle pieces. Why? Because a portion of the molecule is very similar in structure to the natural endorphins that our body produces. Its structure is the only reason why morphine can fit and thereby bring about its effect. Compounds are a special type of molecule. They are 2 or more different kinds of atoms chemically bonded together. All compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds. Kind of a all Cocker Spaniels are dogs, but not all dogs are Cocker Spaniels kind of thing. For example, oxygen molecules are 2 atoms of oxygen bonded together. Therefore, they are molecules, but not compounds. On the other hand, something like sodium chloride is composed of 2 different kinds of atoms. It is therefore both a compound and a molecule. Sodium chloride is also a perfect example of how even at this level of organization, we can see the existence of emergent properties. Sodium chloride has different characteristics than sodium or chlorine. When the metal sodium combines with the toxic gas chlorine, it becomes edible sodium chloride, table salt, which, as long as we don't have high blood pressure, is perfectly safe to be dumping all over our food and ingesting. Sodium chloride is a small and simple molecule, but some molecules can become quite large, called macromolecules. We will be studying 4 macromolecules that are extremely important to the body in Chapter 2 as well. Next, we will spend all of Chapters 3 and 4 exploring the cellular level, discussing the structure and functions of the cell. We will see how both small and large molecules interact with each other to form organelles, which you can think of as the tiny organs of the cell, each with its own structure, which help the cell carry out its major functions. At this level of organization, we will finally be studying biology. Why? Because at this level, we have an incredibly important emergent property: life. We said one of the 8 major properties of living things is that they are composed of cells. Anything composed of at least one cell is alive, and anything alive must be composed of at least one cell. Single-cell organisms are alive, and cells are also the building blocks for multicellular organisms. Although cells all have some common structures and functions, individual cells have quite a lot of variability. Each cell type has its own unique structures to help best carry out its particular functions. Structure is function, and function is structure after all. Here are some examples of different cell types, each with their own unique structures and functions that we will be seeing in the future. Red blood cells. The only cells in the human body which do not have the organelle called a nucleus. The nucleus is the control center of a cell, but red blood cells sacrifice it, dump it out of the cell, to make more room for hemoglobin, in order to best be able to do its assigned task, transporting oxygen. Not having a nucleus also allows it to better squeeze through the tiny little blood vessels in the body. Muscle cells have the ability to contract, to cause movement. There are different types of muscle cells: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac, each with their own properties, which we will be discussing. Skeletal muscles, for instance, are very large, multinucleate cells. Why? Because early on in development, many cells fuse together, each donating their organelles, including their nucleus, to make one much larger cell. Nerve cells, capable of sending electrical signals to, from, and within the brain and spinal cord. They have a lot of processes, axons and dendrites, which can send and receive information. Some of these processes can extend for several feet, reaching from the spinal cord all the way out to our fingers and toes. Sperm cells, the only cell in the human body with a flagella, capable of propelling the cell, a feature much more common in single-celled organisms. Epithelial cells, packed close together, found on the surface of the body, both external and internal, helping provide a barrier to protect us from harmful things found in the environment. When groups of similar cells work together to carry out a common function, we are looking at the tissue level. There are 4 major tissue types, each with their own structure and function: connective, epithelium, muscle, and nervous tissue. The first lab module will be focusing on these 4 major tissue types, as well as the many different subtypes, which are found in Chapter 5 of the textbook. When a structure is composed of at least 2 tissue types, we have the organ level. The heart, the brain, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys. There are so many examples. Since these structures are composed of at least 2 different types of tissues, and usually all 4 different tissue types, they are capable of extremely complex functions. For example, let's look at the stomach. The inside lining is epithelial tissue that produces digestive juices, while the bulk of the stomach wall is muscle tissue, which churns and mixes the food. Connective tissue helps to reinforce the soft muscular walls, and nerve fibers help to regulate digestive activity by controlling muscle contraction and the production and release of digestive juices by glands. When organs work together to accomplish a common purpose, they are part of an organ system. After we focus on chemistry, the atomic and molecular levels in Chapter 2, and cell structure and function in Chapters 3 and 4, and tissues in the lab portion of this course in Chapter 5, we will be moving on to the chapters about organ systems. Chapter 6 will be covering the integumentary system, looking at the importance of skin, hair, and nails. Chapters 7 and 8 will focus on the skeletal system, looking at the importance of not only bones, but cartilage and ligaments as well. Chapters 9 and 10 will explore the muscular system, focusing primarily on the skeletal muscle, but also briefly looking at smooth muscle, which is found in a lot of our internal organs, such as our digestive system, and cardiac muscle, which is found in the heart. And then we will spend 4 chapters, 12, 13, 14, and 15, looking at the importance of the nervous system. In Biology 132, you will then focus on the remaining organ systems, the endocrine, cardiovascular, lymphatic, urinary, digestive, respiratory, and reproductive systems, found in the second half of the textbook. Yes, the good news is that you use the same expensive textbook for both Biology 131 and 132, so don't sell it immediately after completing 131. You will need it again. And this finally brings us to the highest level of organization, the organism level. The organism represents the sum total of all structural levels working together to promote life. And remember the ideal of holism we discussed. We are more than the sum of our parts. It is important to keep in mind as we go through the semester and study the human body at all of these different levels of organization that we will always be talking about the typical structures, the quote-unquote average human. But no two humans are exactly alike. We are all unique. We all show variation. Differences can exist because of sex, age, diet, weight, and level of physical activity. Take a look at the descriptions for an average man or woman. You don't need to memorize these values, but it is important to realize that descriptions of structure, values, and measurements listed throughout the book are referring to the average, but there is a great deal of variation from one person to the next. Now that we have defined biology and listed the 8 major properties necessary for life, as well as defined anatomy and physiology and discussed the different levels at which we can study the structure and function of the body, let's finish up this lecture by returning to one of those 8 major properties of life and discussing it in more detail. Homeostasis. The literal translation of the word homeostasis is unchanging, but that term is inaccurate and misleading. Remember we said earlier in this lecture that homeostasis is the ability to maintain stable internal conditions regardless of the outside environment. To do so actually requires constant changes, small fluctuations that maintain a balance. Therefore, the body is said to be in a state of dynamic equilibrium. Virtually every organ system in the body plays a role in homeostasis. But for equilibrium to be maintained, communication within the body is essential and is accomplished by the nervous system, which uses electrical impulses, and the endocrine system, which uses blood-borne chemicals called hormones, which makes these 2 systems particularly important. A homeostatic control system consists of 3 interdependent components. The receptor, which acts as a sensor and monitors the environment and detects changes and imbalances, which we call stimuli. It sends information through the afferent pathway, afferent with an A, to the control center. The control center determines the set point, the ideal value at which we want the variable to be maintained. The control center will compare the incoming information from the receptor to the ideal set point and determines if an action needs to be taken. It will then send information out through the efferent pathway, efferent with an E, out to the effector. The effector has the ability to bring about the desired effect, the desired change, hopefully returning the variable to the desired ideal, returning the body to equilibrium, maintaining balance, restoring homeostasis. Temperature stability is a perfect example of maintaining dynamic equilibrium. Let's forget about the human body for a minute and look at temperature in a way we are more familiar with. Room temperature, in your house, apartment, or office. The thermostat in this case is the control center. It determines the set point, the ideal. Maybe you want to set it for 68 degrees. Keep in mind that the temperature of the room fluctuates. It is never exactly what you set it for, 68 degrees in this example. It may be as high as 70 degrees or as low as 66 degrees. It is not unchanging. It is constantly changing, but trying to maintain the optimal temperature. If, the temperature gets too low, this will act as a stimulus. The stimulus is detected by the receptor, in this case the thermometer. The thermometer sends this information to the control center via the afferent pathway. The control center, the thermostat, compares the current temperature to the ideal and makes a decision that it is too far from the set point. The temperature is too low. The thermostat will then send this information to the effector, the heater in this case, via the efferent pathway, and signals it to kick on. The heater is the effector because it brings about the desired effect, in this case, raising the temperature. Once it is on, it will probably overshoot the desired temperature by a little bit, maybe bring it all the way up to 70 degrees before kicking off. How does it know when to kick off? It kicks off when the temperature gets too high. In this example, the temperature is once again the stimulus. The receptor is once again the thermometer. It responds to the increase in temperature, the stimulus. It sends information regarding the temperature to the control center, the thermostat, via the afferent pathway, which compares the current temperature to the ideal. It will once again make the decision, this time that the temperature is too high compared to the set point. The thermostat then sends information to the effector, once again the heater, via the efferent pathway, and this time signals it to turn off. Hopefully, by turning off the heater, the room temperature will now decrease. In this way, the heater cycles on and off, and the temperature is always fluctuating, but the temperature is remaining close to the ideal temperature that you desired. The body is much the same way. We all know the ideal body temperature is 98.6 degrees, at least for the average person. But in reality, the body temperature is always fluctuating some, trying to maintain this ideal temperature. If the temperature gets too high, what does the body do? It will cause blood vessels to dilate, bringing the blood closer to the surface of the body, allowing more heat to escape. And if we get too hot, we'll start to sweat, reducing the body temperature. If the temperature gets too low, what does the body do to raise it? Well, for one, it's going to cause blood vessels to constrict, reducing the loss of heat from the skin. And if we get too cold, we'll start to shiver to produce more heat. An example of dynamic equilibrium, a relatively stable internal environment regardless of the outside environment, at least up to a certain point. Most homeostatic control mechanisms are negative feedback mechanisms. By negative, we don't mean bad. We mean that it causes the variable to change in the opposite direction to that of the initial change. The output shuts off the original stimulus. It attempts to return the variable to the ideal value. If something gets too high, a negative feedback mechanism will lower it. If something gets too low, a negative feedback mechanism will raise it. Dynamic equilibrium. Constantly fluctuating, but always trying to maintain a happy medium. The body is constantly trying to maintain homeostasis, trying to achieve a happy medium. So controlling body temperature is just one of many, many examples of negative feedback mechanisms. Let's look at another, blood pressure. I'm sure you've all had the experience of getting up too fast and feeling a little lightheaded or dizzy. This is the result of a quick drop in blood pressure. It's actually amazing that we only get this lightheaded feeling every once in a while. In fact, it's actually an impressive feat of the body that we don't simply pass out every time we stand up. When you are horizontal, the heart is not having to work against gravity to get blood to your head. But when you stand, gravity is suddenly helping to drain the blood very quickly from your head, and your heart is now having to pump the blood against gravity to have it reach your brain. This drop in blood pressure, this decrease in blood flow to the brain, could have disastrous consequences if not corrected for. So once again, our bodies use receptors, in this case, baroreceptors, that detect pressure. They are embedded in the walls of the blood vessels above the heart. When they detect this drop in blood pressure, they send information via the afferent pathway to the control center, in this case, the brainstem. The brainstem compares the blood pressure to the set point, the ideal value, and determines that the blood pressure is too low. It then sends information to the effector, in this case the heart, via the efferent pathway, and signals the heart to speed up, which raises the blood pressure, restoring homeostasis. If these negative feedback mechanisms don't respond quickly enough, don't restore homeostasis fast enough, as occurs more commonly in the elderly, then a person will get lightheaded and dizzy and may even faint. In addition to blood pressure and body temperature, the body also uses negative feedback mechanisms to control the rate and depth of breathing, the levels of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nutrients in the blood, and even the withdrawal reflex is an example of negative feedback, which occurs when we touch something painful, if it is sharp or hot, and we pull our hand or our foot back. Can you think of any other examples of things that are probably controlled by negative feedback mechanisms in the body? In addition to negative feedback mechanisms, the body also sometimes uses positive feedback mechanisms. Once again, the word positive does not mean good, but rather it refers to the fact that the output enhances the original stimulus so that the output is accelerated. It causes the variable to change in the same direction to that of the initial change. If something gets too high, a positive feedback mechanism will continue to raise it even more. If something gets too low, a positive feedback mechanism will continue to lower it even more. In other words, rather than restoring homeostasis, positive feedback mechanisms cause the body to move farther away from equilibrium, farther away from the happy medium. As a result, they are often referred to as cascades, because once initiated, they are self-perpetuating and have an amplifying effect. Given what we have just described, it is not surprising that positive feedback mechanisms are not nearly as common as negative feedback mechanisms. They usually control infrequent events that do not require continuous adjustments. Even though positive feedback mechanisms are not used as frequently as negative feedback mechanisms, they still play an important role in the body. In some instances, causing the body to move away from equilibrium, bringing about some kind of change, is okay for a time and can even be helpful. Blood clotting and labor contractions are both examples of the body using positive feedback mechanisms. When we are injured and bleeding, we want to minimize blood loss. We want to stop the flow of blood. As we will discuss in more detail in Biology 132, this is achieved partly by blood cells called platelets attaching to the damaged tissue and releasing chemicals, which attract more platelets, which release more chemicals, which attract more platelets, and so on. When a woman goes into labor, the head of the baby pushes up against the cervix, which results in the release of a chemical called oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates the uterus to contract, which causes the baby's head to be pushed up against the cervix, which causes more oxytocin to be released, which causes more labor contractions, and so on. The use of positive feedback mechanisms to create these amplification effects in blood clotting and labor contractions are useful and necessary functions for a period of time. But we certainly don't want to have all of our blood clot, and I think most women would agree that they would really prefer not to be in labor for the rest of their lives. So we don't want these actions to continue indefinitely. We want them to occur long enough to bring about the desired change and then stop. Because positive feedback mechanisms are self-perpetuating, have an amplifying effect, and bring the body further away from equilibrium, they can be harmful and even life-threatening. For example, when our body is fighting off an infection, it can be beneficial for the body temperature to rise to a certain extent. But if the temperature gets too high, it can be extremely dangerous. As the body temperature rises, it increases metabolism. Higher metabolism, in other words, more chemical reactions, in turn raises the temperature, which raises the metabolism, which raises the temperature, leading to a vicious cycle, a dangerous cycle, which if not corrected can lead to seizures, coma, and even death. Remember that ultimately homeostasis is one of the 8 major properties of life. Physiology, the functioning of the body, is largely a group of mechanisms maintaining homeostasis, and the loss of homeostatic control is often the cause of illness and death. We can bring the body away from equilibrium for a time to bring about change, but if equilibrium is not restored and maintained, life cannot continue to exist. That brings us to the end of this lecture. On this last slide, you will find a list of chapter objectives. Before attempting the lecture exam at the end of this module, you should be sure that you have achieved these objectives. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns about these objectives, or anything that we have gone over in this packet, please post them in the discussion forum where I and other students can respond and attempt to clear up any confusion. Or you can email me directly if you prefer. Don't forget to be working on the lab material for this module. Have a good day.